My family buried me alive for 15 years, labeling me a failure who quit the Navy. At my brother's graduation, my father, the admiral, didn't even say my name. But then a top commander locked eyes with me from across the hall and roared, "Commander Seal, ma'am!" In that instant, their perfect world started to burn. And I was holding the match. My name is Tiana Brooks. I am 42 years old, and for the last 15 years, I have been a ghost in my own family's story. The life I lived, the air I breathed, the blood I shed, none of it was real to them. To them, I was a failure, a quitter, a shame. The ping from my phone was a cold, metallic sound in the quiet of my small, rustic cabin in the Virginia foothills. It was a sound that didn't belong amongst the scent of pine and old wood. The message on the screen was from my mother, Eleanor. It wasn't an invitation. It was a set of orders. Kaylin's graduation, 10 a.m. Dahlgren Hall. Sit in the back. Don't let anyone see you. Don't embarrass the Brooks name again. There was no love, Mom, no hope to see you there. Just a directive, as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. This was my role, the invisible disgrace, summoned only to fulfill a silent, bitter obligation. I pulled on a simple plaid shirt and a worn pair of jeans, the kind of clothes that had become my uniform in this quiet life. I bypassed the sleek, black sedan in the garage, a relic of a past I was supposed to have had, and climbed into the driver's seat of my old Ford F-150. Its engine rumbled to life, a low, honest sound. It was a workhorse, not a show pony. It was me. The drive to Annapolis was a journey through another world. I left the winding country roads of Virginia for the manicured highways of Maryland, my dusty pickup increasingly out of place amongst a sea of gleaming Mercedes and BMWs. The polished chrome of their grilles reflected a world of power and influence, the world my family inhabited. I could feel the sideways glances from other drivers, their eyes flicking from their leather-trimmed dashboards to my truck's faded paint. They didn't see a decorated warrior. They saw a handyman, a laborer. They saw what my family wanted them to see. Dahlgren Hall was a cathedral of military honor, its vast space built to hold the weight of history and the thunder of applause. Portraits of great admirals, their eyes stern and knowing, lined the walls. My grandfather's portrait was among them. I walked past it, a nameless descendant, and found my designated place of exile. A hard wooden chair in the last row, partially obscured by a thick, unforgiving pillar. From the corner of my eye, I saw my mother, resplendent in a St. John knit suit, murmur to a friend, another admiral's wife. I didn't need to hear the words to know their meaning. I heard a faint whisper on the air, carried by the hull's acoustics. "Oh, that one, she's just here for appearances. Don't mind her." I fixed my eyes forward and let my face go blank. A mask of placid indifference. It was a skill I hadn't learned in a debutante ball, but in the sweltering heat of Kandahar and the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. The art of becoming nothing, the art of survival. Then my father, retired Admiral Thaddeus Brooks, stepped to the podium. He was a monument of a man with a full head of silver hair and a posture that could command fleets. His voice, honed by decades of command, boomed through the hall, a rich baritone weaving a grand tapestry of honor, duty, and legacy. "The Brooks family," he declared, his gaze sweeping over the assembled dignitaries, "has served this nation for 4 generations. We have answered the call in times of war and peace. We understand that service is not a choice, it is an inheritance." He spoke of my grandfather's valor at Midway, of his own service during the Cold War. He lavished praise upon my younger brother, Kalen, who sat in the front row, his new ensign's uniform pristine, his face glowing with pride. And today, my father's voice swelled with emotion. My son, Kalen, continues that proud tradition. He carries the torch of the Brooks legacy into the future. He looked at Kalen with an expression of boundless pride, a father seeing his perfect creation. He never once glanced towards the back of the hall. He never once mentioned my name. In his grand narrative, in the glorious history of the Brooks family, I was a footnote that had been erased, a chapter torn from the book and burned. I sat perfectly still, my breathing even, my pulse steady. A ghost at my own family's feast. The ceremony was nearing its end when the great oak doors at the back of the hall opened. A man in a decorated uniform stepped inside, moving with the quiet urgency of someone arriving late but with purpose. Lieutenant Commander Jax Thorne, Kalen's new commanding officer. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the crowd. He was looking for his new ensign, for my family. But then his scan stopped. His gaze broke from the front rows, from the sea of glittering uniforms and society wives, and locked onto the shadows in the back. Onto the pillar, onto me. I saw it on his face. First, a flicker of confusion, then a wave of dawning recognition. His posture, already ramrod straight, seemed to harden into granite. The casual search in his eyes transformed into a look of profound, undiluted respect. In the hallowed silence of Dahlgren Hall, under the gaze of 100 decorated officers and their families, Lieutenant Commander Thorne snapped to attention. His arm shot up in a crisp, perfect salute. His voice, clear and powerful, shattered the room's decorum like a rifle shot. "Commander Seal, ma'am." The words hung in the air, electric and undeniable. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Every head, from the front row admirals to the back row families, swiveled in my direction. In the front row, I saw my mother's hand fly to her mouth, her Chanel purse clattering to the polished floor. I saw my father's jaw clench so hard, a muscle jumped in his cheek, his face a mask of cold fury. I saw Kalen, my golden boy brother, frozen in his seat, his face pale with disbelief. The lie they had so carefully constructed for 15 years, the myth of the daughter who failed, had just been demolished. It was torn to shreds by 2 words and a single stunning gesture. The performance was over. The ghost was real. The low rumble of the Ford's engine was the only sound as I drove west on Route 50, leaving the pristine world of Annapolis behind. The chaos of Dahlgren Hall had faded, but the silence inside my truck was now filled with a question that echoed louder than any military salute. How did it come to this? How did my life, a life of service and sacrifice, become a lie so fragile it could be shattered by 2 simple words? My mind drifted from the present, away from Lieutenant Commander Thorne's shocking salute, and landed on a sweltering summer afternoon when I was 16. It wasn't the first crack in the foundation of my family, but it was the first one I truly felt. I had just returned home from the National Marksmanship Championships in Colorado Springs, the heavy gold-plated trophy cool and solid in my hands. My heart was pounding with a pure teenage pride. I had done something extraordinary. I ran, not walked, to my father's study, the one room in our Georgetown house that felt like the seat of power, the command center of our lives. He was there behind his large mahogany desk. "Dad, look!" I exclaimed, holding out the trophy. He looked up. His eyes, the same shade of slate gray as the Atlantic in a storm, moved from my face to the trophy and then back. There was no smile, no flicker of pride, just a cold, hard appraisal. He stood up, took the trophy from my hands without a word, and walked past me. I followed, confused, as he went to the heavy-duty trash can in the kitchen. With a dull metallic thud, he dropped my victory into the bin alongside coffee grounds and discarded newspapers. He turned back to face me, his 6'2" frame casting a long shadow over me. "The Brooks family does not raise sharpshooters," he said, his voice low and final. "We raise leaders. You are a young lady, Tiana. You will act like one. Your future is at a desk, supporting men like your brother, not in the dirt with a rifle." That was the first time I understood. My accomplishments, my passions, they were worthless if they didn't fit into the script he had written. I wasn't a person, I was a role, and I had chosen the wrong part. The first wound had been inflicted, and it would dictate the shape of all the scars to come. Years later, another memory. I was 27, standing in that same formal living room. I had just survived Hell Week. I had endured the bone-chilling cold of the Coronado surf, the endless miles of running in wet sand, the soul-crushing exhaustion of basic underwater demolition dark seal training. But I had done what few men and virtually no women before me had ever done. A quiet, foolish hope had brought me home, a belief that this achievement would finally be enough. I told them plainly. I graduated from Bud S. I'm a Navy SEAL. The reaction was not what I had hoped for. My mother, Eleanor, didn't swell with pride. She burst into tears of pure, unadulterated fear. Her hand flew to her pearls. "Oh my God, Thaddeus," she sobbed. "What will people say? What will the papers write? Think of the family's reputation, a woman doing that." My father didn't raise his voice. He never had to. His power lay in his stillness, in the crushing weight of his pronouncements. He let my mother's sobs subside before he spoke the words that would become my prison sentence for the next 15 years. "Your work is classified, Tiana," he stated, his voice as flat as a battleship's hull. "Therefore, your entire existence from this point forward will be classified. As of today, to the world, to this family, you do not exist in that capacity. You have chosen this path. Now you will walk it in silence." He didn't just accept my duty, he weaponized it against me. He turned my oath to my country into a gag order on my life. I was no longer his daughter. I was a state secret, a classified file to be locked away in the deepest, darkest vault of the family's consciousness. He had buried me alive. That night, back in my small, anonymous apartment in Virginia Beach, I broke. The discipline that had carried me through Hell Week shattered, and I cried. I cried for the 16-year-old girl whose victory was thrown in the trash. I cried for the 27-year-old woman whose monumental achievement was met with shame and fear. I cried for the daughter who would never be enough. Then, through the haze of tears, I remembered something. A book. A worn, leather-bound copy of The Strenuous Life that my grandfather, a stoic old Marine who smelled of salt water and Old Spice, had given me before he passed. He understood the fire in me in a way my father never could. He had underlined a single passage in the book, a passage by Theodore Roosevelt. I found the book on my shelf, its pages soft with age. And there, under the faint glow of my bedside lamp, I read the words that would become my shield, my armor, my creed. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. My family could be the critics. They could sit in their comfortable box seats, pointing out my perceived stumbles. But they were not in the arena. I was. My face was the one marred by dust and sweat and blood. My hands were the ones that did the deeds. That night I made a choice. I would not live for their approval. I would live for the arena. I had chosen the arena. But what did that arena truly cost me? What was the real price of silence? The question followed me home from Annapolis, a silent passenger in my truck. What was the real price of silence? The answer wasn't in a single dramatic moment. It was written in the quiet, brutal arithmetic of my daily life, in the accumulated cost of 15 years spent in the arena. Back in the solitude of my cabin, the silence was no longer a comfort. It was a mirror reflecting everything I had lost. I peeled off my shirt, the rough plaid fabric scraping against my skin. In the dim light of the bathroom, I faced my own history. My back and shoulders were a roadmap of my career, a tapestry of faint, silvery lines. Each scar was a souvenir from a place that didn't officially exist on any map. A jagged line above my shoulder blade from a piece of shrapnel in Kandahar, a puckered circle on my side from a ricochet in a Somali pirate stronghold, a long thin scar on my forearm from a knife fight in a nameless jungle. My mind went to a freezing night on a desolate ridge in the Hindu Kush. We were ambushed. I dragged my radio operator, a kid named Miller with a picture of his high school sweetheart, taped inside his helmet, out of the kill zone. Later, huddled behind a rock outcropping, I'd found a deep gash in my own arm. With a field suture kit and the faint, shaky beam of a headlamp, I stitched my own skin back together. There was no anesthetic, no sterile operating room, just the biting wind, the immense silence of the mountains, and the ragged sound of my own breathing. I wondered what my family was doing at that exact moment. They were likely at a political fundraiser or a black tie gala at the Army and Navy Club in D.C., sipping champagne, debating policy. While they were discussing abstract threats to national security, I was sewing one of those threats out of my own body. They had no idea their daughter, their sister, was fighting to keep breathing. To them, I was simply away. My dinner that night was the same as most nights. It wasn't the prime rib or lobster thermidor served on fine china at the clubs my father frequented. It was the meal of efficiency, of survival. A can of tuna, a sleeve of saltine crackers, and a glass of water from the tap. It was a habit forged in the field, where food was fuel, not pleasure. The taste of it brought back the memory of weeks spent subsisting on cold MREs, meals ready to eat, where the highlight of your day was finding a packet of peanut butter that wasn't frozen solid. I remembered dreaming of a hot meal, something as simple as a cheeseburger or a bowl of chili. It was during one of those deployments, while recovering in a noisy, chaotic field hospital in Afghanistan, that I'd received a postcard. The picture was of my family, my parents and Kaylin, grinning on a sailboat, the waters of Martha's Vineyard sparkling behind them. They all looked so happy, so tanned, so impossibly far away. On the back, in my mother's elegant script, were the words, "Darling, wish you were here, though we know you can't be. Do try to find yourself and come home soon. Love, Mom." find myself. They thought I was on some kind of spiritual journey, a backpacking trip through Europe, while I was lying on a cot, my veins dripping with morphine, my body paying the price for their gilded peace. The postcard felt heavier than any piece of equipment I'd ever carried. It was the weight of their complete, willful ignorance. I finished my sparse meal and cleaned the tin can, my movements methodical, automatic. The quiet of the cabin settled around me again. It was a fragile peace, a temporary truce in a war I didn't even know was still being fought. Then the truce was broken. A shrill, piercing beep sliced through the silence. It came from a small, hardened steel box inside my gun safe, my secure satellite reader, a relic from my old life I was supposed to have left behind, but a precaution I could never bring myself to abandon. I quickly opened the safe, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. The screen was flashing with a pulsing, deep red alert. 2 words, stark and terrifying. Access alert. File dagger point. My breath caught in my throat. My blood ran cold. Of all the operations, all the missions, it had to be Dagger Point, the most sensitive, the bloodiest, the one that had left the deepest, most invisible scars of all. Someone wasn't just looking. Someone with high-level clearance was actively trying to access or alter the record. And the electronic trail originated from the one place that could turn a historical inquiry into a present-day threat. Deep inside the U.S. Navy's command archives, the shadow I had lived in for 15 years was no longer a refuge. It had become a hunting ground. And I was the prey. There was no time for deliberation. The Dagger Point alert was a declaration of war. In my world, you didn't respond to a declaration of war by committee. You responded with immediate, decisive action. And in my isolated life, there was only one person I could trust to go to war with. I didn't call. Phone calls could be intercepted. I grabbed my keys, a go bag that was always packed, and got in my truck. For 3 hours I drove, pushing the Ford F-150 through the winding forested roads of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The deeper I went into the heart of Virginia, the further I felt from the polished deceit of Washington, D.C. My destination was a secluded farm, a picture of rural tranquility with a white fenced pasture and a rambling old farmhouse. It was the last place anyone would look for one of the most sophisticated private intelligence hubs on the East Coast. It was the home of Master Chief Wren Spectre Harding, my former team's technical wizard. She was on the porch as I pulled up, sitting in a rocking chair. A disassembled rifle lay across her lap, each piece being meticulously cleaned with an oiled cloth. Wren was a woman of stark contrasts, a farmer's tan and a network engineer's mind, a quiet demeanor and an almost supernatural ability to navigate the digital world. She was, in every sense, a ghost in the machine. She didn't look up as I approached. "Knew you'd come," she said, her voice as calm and steady as her hands. My system lit up like a Christmas tree half an hour ago. Someone's poking the hornet's nest. There were no pleasantries, no catching up. We didn't need it. Our bond wasn't forged over coffee. It was forged under fire. It was a trust that transcended words. I followed her inside, through a normal-looking farmhouse kitchen, and down a flight of stairs hidden behind a pantry wall. The temperature dropped, and the scent of earth and old wood was replaced by the cool, clean hum of electronics. We entered her command center, the barn, as she called it. It was a technological marvel, screens glowing with lines of code, servers humming quietly in climate-controlled racks. "Norfolk," I said, getting straight to the point. "The access alert on Dagger Point came from the Naval Command Archives. Wren's fingers danced across her keyboard, a blur of efficient motion. She was a virtuoso, and this was her orchestra. Lines of data streamed across the main monitor. "It's not a random query, Commander," she confirmed, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "This is targeted. They're trying to rewrite history, deleting audio logs, altering after-action reports. It's a systematic purge." My stomach tightened. I reached into my go bag and pulled out a small, heavily encrypted hard drive. I placed it on the console beside her. It was my insurance policy, a complete, unedited, off-the-books record of the entire Dagger Point operation, a copy the Pentagon had no idea existed. "I'm always prepared for betrayal, Wren," I said, my voice cold, "especially from our own." She took the drive, her expression unreadable, and plugged it into her system. As my pristine data loaded, the full picture of the conspiracy began to emerge. It was coordinated. It was deep. "They're setting you up," Wren concluded, finally turning to look at me. Her eyes, usually so calm, held a flicker of cold anger. "They need a scapegoat, and the ghost who was never really there is the perfect candidate." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "Saw your father on TV last week, one of those Sunday morning political shows. He was talking about how there's no room for weakness or personal failure in the military. The hypocrisy is breathtaking." The words hung in the air, a bitter confirmation of the world I'd left behind versus the one I was in now. My own father saw me as a failure to be hidden. The woman in front of me, bound to me by nothing more than a shared history of violence and loyalty, saw me as a commander to be defended. Wren turned back to her screens, her focus absolute. "They made one mistake," she said, her fingers resuming their rapid-fire typing. "They forgot that ghosts always leave a trail, and I'm the best damn tracker there is." The unspoken oath passed between us in that quiet, humming basement. This was no longer just about my past. It was about our shared truth. If they wanted to erase Dagger Point, if they wanted to bury what we did and who we were, they would have to get through us both. The text from Wren arrived an hour later, a single encrypted line that made the air in my cabin feel thin and cold. "Second access trace complete. Civilian IP address, Georgetown, Washington, D.C. It matches the Admiral's home network." There it was. The ghost haunting the machine had a face I knew all too well. I knew what I had to do. There was no running from this. The shadow of my family had finally stretched long enough to find me, and it was time to turn and face it. The drive to Georgetown felt different this time. I wasn't going as an invisible daughter summoned by a cold text message. I was going as a commander on a mission to confront a threat. I parked my truck down the street from the stately brick house where I grew up, a place I hadn't set foot in for 5 years. The house looked the same, imposing, perfect, its windows like indifferent eyes staring out at the manicured lawn. The housekeeper let me in with a surprised but polite nod. My father was in his study, of course he was. The room was his sanctuary, his fortress of ego. It was a museum dedicated to the Brooks legacy. Oak-paneled walls were covered with photographs. My great-grandfather in his naval whites, my grandfather at the helm of a destroyer, and dozens of pictures of Kalen at every stage of his life, in his first little sailor suit, at his commissioning, smiling beside our father. There were models of battleships, framed medals, ceremonial swords. And in this entire shrine to family honor, there wasn't a single photograph of me. My erasure was not an oversight. It was a deliberate, curated act. "I knew you would come," my father said, his voice smooth. He was standing by the window, looking out at the garden. He didn't turn around. He didn't offer me a seat. Lieutenant Commander Thorne called me, he continued, his tone laced with annoyance. He caused quite a mess. The audacity of it struck me. He wasn't angry at the lie. He was angry that the lie had been exposed. He blamed the man who had shown me respect, not himself, for demanding my invisibility. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. You accessed the Daggerpoint file. Why? He finally turned, his face a mask of calm authority. He walked to the wet bar in the corner of the study and poured a generous amount of bourbon into a heavy crystal glass. The clink of the decanter against the glass was the only sound. He took his time, as if this were a perfectly normal conversation. A Congressional Oversight Committee is looking into some old operations, he said, swirling the amber liquid. They're on a witch hunt. My name came up, then yours. They'd heard rumors, whispers of a female commander involved in a compromised mission. He took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving mine. I couldn't very well tell a Senate committee that I was unaware of my own daughter's service record. So I needed to see what you had done. I needed to know what I was dealing with, to protect the family's reputation. The confession was a physical blow, more painful than any shrapnel. It wasn't about me. It was never about me. It wasn't about my safety, my honor, or the truth of what happened. It was about him, about protecting his perfect image, his unblemished career, his precious family name. After 15 years of burying me, he was now trying to dig up my corpse to use as a shield. He wanted to claim credit for a daughter he had sentenced to a living death. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped my lips. Protect the reputation? You erased me from it. You ordered me to be silent, and now you want to use that silence to polish your own name? The chasm between us, the one that had been widening for decades, was now an impassable abyss. He saw my life as a strategic asset to be managed. I saw his words as the ultimate betrayal. He set his glass down, his expression shifting into something I couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger, it was something closer to weariness. You didn't fail, Tiana, he said, his voice dropping to an almost whisper. You succeeded, in a way we were never prepared for, and in doing so you forced us to look at our own failures. That's why it hurts. It was the closest he'd ever come to an apology, but it was wrapped in the same suffocating blanket of his own perspective. He slid a small black USB drive across the polished surface of his desk. It stopped inches from my hand. A peace offering, or a bribe. This is what the committee has requested, he said. The official report, handle it. I picked up the drive. It felt cold in my hand. I'm not here to fix this for you, Admiral, I said, the formal title a deliberate wall between us. I'm not here to help you patch up your story. I turned to leave. I'm here because something much darker is coming, and you just handed me the first piece of the puzzle. Back in my cabin, the small black USB drive my father had given me felt like a dead weight in my hand. It was a piece of a puzzle, but I knew it wasn't the whole picture. The official report. I didn't trust it. To find the real truth, I needed to go back to the source. I sent a secure message to the one man who held the original soundtrack to my past, Chief Petty Officer Leo Echo Vance, my former team's communications specialist. He was living a quiet civilian life in suburban Ohio now, but I knew he'd have a copy. Leo never threw anything away. He was a digital archivist by nature. Within an hour, a heavily encrypted audio file appeared in my inbox. I plugged in my headphones, the soft cups blocking out the world, and pressed play. Instantly, I was no longer in my quiet Virginia cabin. I was back in the dust and chaos of Dagger Point. The sharp crack of rifle fire, the distant crump of a mortar, the frantic shouts in a language I understood as well as my own. The sounds were so vivid they were almost physical. Then, through the static, came Leo's voice, tight with stress but professional. "Commander, target package is in the eastern building, but we have a problem. The adjacent building, the western one, is on fire. It's full of civilians. I count at least 20, maybe more, trapped on the upper floors. Do we retrieve the package or do we rescue the civilians? What are your orders?" I remembered that moment with perfect, terrible clarity. The weight of it. On one hand, the mission, a high-value intelligence package that could prevent a future attack. On the other, 23 human lives, 23 men, women, and children who would burn to death if we followed our original orders. 4 seconds of silence stretched into an eternity on the recording. 4 seconds where I weighed my duty against my humanity. Then I heard my own voice, calm, clear, and absolute. "Evacuate the civilians. First priority. The data can wait. Echo, get a medevac chopper on the line, now." The recording ended. I took off the headphones, the silence of my cabin, rushing back in, feeling heavier than before. A moment later, my secure phone buzzed. A message from Leo. "They twisted it, Commander. The official report I saw before I retired. They wrote that you abandoned a primary objective due to a flawed emotional assessment. They turned our choice, our moral choice, into a tactical error. They made you the fall guy." I squeezed my phone, my knuckles white. It wasn't just a lie. It was an insult. A desecration of the single most important decision I had ever made as a leader. It was a mockery of the very principle I had built my life on. You never leave anyone behind. As if on cue, my phone rang. The caller ID read, "Eleanor Brooks, my mother." A cold knot formed in my stomach. She never called. "Your father told me," she said, her voice sharp and brittle, devoid of any warmth. "He told me what the committee is looking into, that you were reckless on a mission, that you let your feelings get in the way." Her voice rose, laced with the familiar tone of long-suffering disappointment. "You see, Tiana, this is why we had to keep you a secret. This is why. You've always been impulsive, never thinking about the consequences, about how your actions reflect on this family." I didn't say a word. I just listened as she confirmed everything Leo had said. To her, the official lie was the convenient truth. I was flawed. I was the problem. I ended the call, my hand trembling slightly. That was it, the final push, the last straw. The combination of the system's cold-blooded lie and my own mother's stinging, blind accusation ignited something inside me. A quiet, simmering anger that had been suppressed for 15 years finally boiled over into a cold, hard resolve. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the first drops of an evening rain begin to streak down the glass. The world outside grew dark. I thought of my grandmother, a devout woman who saw the world in clear terms of right and wrong. I remembered a verse she had underlined in her worn family Bible, a verse from Isaiah she said was a roadmap for life. Learn to do right, seek justice, correct the oppressor. I had been silent for too long. I had allowed them to define me. I had allowed them to bury me, no more. This was no longer just about my reputation. This was about the 23 people who were alive today because of that flawed emotional assessment. It was about Leo and Ren and every member of my team who had trusted my judgment. It was about my honor. I looked at my own reflection in the dark, rain-streaked window, and I asked myself a question, not just for me, but for anyone who has ever been silenced, ever been made to feel small for doing what they knew was right. What do you do when the world calls your compassion a weakness? What do you do when your own family calls your integrity a flaw? Do you accept their story and fade away? Or do you burn their narrative to the ground and build your own from the ashes? If it were you, what would you choose? Let me know in the comments. I knew my answer. The time for silence was over. The time for correction had come. I picked up my phone, my hand perfectly steady now. I dialed a number I knew by heart. "Ren," I said, the moment she answered. "It's time. We're going to war, publicly." The ghost was done hiding. The commander was back in charge. My declaration of war hung in the air between Virginia and Ohio. A promise sealed over a secure line. Back in Ren's subterranean command center, the atmosphere shifted. The quiet contemplation of the past was over. This was now a mission briefing. We were a two-person SEAL team, working with the fluid efficiency that comes only from shared combat experience. There was no sentiment, only strategy. "If we're going public, we need to know who we're fighting," I said, my voice all business. Ren's fingers were already a blur on the keyboard, diving deep into the labyrinth of Pentagon servers. She peeled back layers of firewalls and security protocols like an onion. "It's not your father," she said, after a few minutes of intense silence, her eyes glued to a cascade of code. "He's just a pawn, a high-ranking one, but a pawn nonetheless. The king on this chessboard is Colonel Donovan the Architect Reed." The name hit me like a physical punch to the gut. I froze. Colonel Reed, my former mentor at the Naval War College, a man who had built his entire career on the principles of cold, hard, data-driven strategy, a man who once told me, in a private, condescending tone, that women weren't built for the cold calculus of command in the shadows. He believed our empathy was a fatal flaw. Ren didn't stop. And guess who's been Reed's primary sponsor for the last 20 years? Who put him on the fast track for promotion and shielded him from internal reviews? She paused for dramatic effect, then delivered the final blow. Your father, Admiral Thaddeus Brooks. The betrayal suddenly had another, uglier layer. It wasn't just my father hiding his failure of a daughter. It was my father actively promoting the very man, the very ideology that sought to erase people like me. His prejudice wasn't just a private failing, it was a public policy he had championed. "Reed is too powerful for a direct assault," I said, shaking off the shock and shifting into tactical mode. "He's a master of disinformation. He'll bury us in paperwork and bury our reputations in slander. We can't fight him on his terms. We need a surgical strike." An idea began to form, a memory of a conversation, a rumor I'd heard years ago. "Ren, pull up the service record for retired Colonel Evelyn Valkyrie Shaw." Ren raised an eyebrow but didn't question the order. Shaw, she was Reed's contemporary, a legend in naval intelligence. Rumor is she retired early because she got fed up with the politics. "Exactly," I said. The Valkyrie was a straight shooter. If anyone ever stood up to Reed and his lies, it would have been her. Check her personal logs, any encrypted files she might have archived upon retirement. Look for anything related to Reed. For the next hour, the only sounds were the hum of the servers and the relentless click of Ren's keyboard. Then she stopped. "Got it," she breathed. Tucked away in a protected partition of Shaw's retirement file was a single, heavily encrypted audio log. It took Ren another 20 minutes to crack it. It was a recording of a blistering, closed-door confrontation between Shaw and Reed. It wasn't about Dagger Point. It was about another mission, years earlier, where a young officer's career had been destroyed to cover up a catastrophic planning error made by Reed himself. Shaw's voice was cold fury. Reed's was a smooth, dismissive denial. It wasn't direct evidence, but it was something better. It was a character witness statement from beyond the grave of a career. It was a pattern of behavior. This was our weapon. "We're not going to the press," I said, my plan solidifying. "That's a ground war. We need an airstrike, a psychological operation." I leaned over the console. "Send the Shaw recording anonymously, not to the media, not to the Oversight Committee. Send it to 3 people and 3 people only. Admiral Miller, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Franklin, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and Senator Hayes, head of the Armed Services Committee." Wren smiled, a rare, wolfish grin. She understood immediately. "His peers," she said. "The men he has drinks with at the club. The ones who would look like fools for having backed a snake for so long." "There's nothing the old guard hates more than being embarrassed," I confirmed. "We won't attack Reed. We'll let them eat their own." This is how SEALs operate: precision, efficiency, maximum impact with minimum exposure. As Wren prepared the files, my secure phone buzzed again. It was Leo. "Commander," he said, his voice alive with an energy I hadn't heard in years. "I found them. 2 of the civilians we pulled out of that building. The father of that little girl you carried out, and the local elder. They're in the States now, living in Michigan under an asylum program. When I told them someone was trying to rewrite the story, they didn't hesitate. They said they would testify to anyone, anytime." A wave of relief and gratitude washed over me. The pieces were falling into place. The fight was no longer mine alone. It was a fight for the truth. And the truth had just found its voice. The hearing room was deep in the secure confines of the Pentagon, a place known as a SCIF, Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility. It was a sterile, windowless box designed to keep secrets in. Today, it would be the stage where a secret was finally let out. The air was cold, recycled, and thick with tension. I walked in, wearing my service dress blues for the first time in a decade. The uniform felt foreign on my skin, but it was a necessary piece of armor for this battle. At the long, polished table sat the members of the Oversight Committee: 3 admirals, a general, and Senator Hayes. Across from them sat Colonel Donovan Reed, looking relaxed and confident in his own immaculate uniform. And in the designated family section, my family, my father, a stone-faced statue of military bearing, my mother, looking pale and anxious, and Kalen, my brother, whose eyes refused to meet mine. I was the defendant, the ghost they had summoned to be exorcised. A civilian consultant hired by the committee, a man named Dr. Alistair Finch with a smug smile and a condescending air, was already speaking. He was Reed's hired gun, brought in to provide a psychological autopsy of my failure. The decision made by then Commander Brooks during Operation Dagger Point, Dr. Finch began, his voice oozing with patronizing authority, is a classic textbook example of command compromised by emotion. The data was clear. The primary objective was the priority. Her choice to divert resources to a secondary humanitarian concern suggests a leader whose judgment was clouded. He paused, letting his words sink in. One might even argue that a misplaced maternal instinct superseded her tactical imperative. A clear case of emotional instability under pressure, a trait that, regrettably, can sometimes manifest in female leaders in high-stress combat roles. A low murmur went through the room. I saw Senator Hayes frown slightly, but the admirals remained impassive. My mother sank lower in her chair, her face burning with shame. My father's hand, resting on the table, clenched into a white-knuckled fist. They were painting me as a hysterical woman, a sacrificial lamb offered up to protect the system's infallibility. Reed simply watched, a faint, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He was winning, but just as Dr. Finch was about to continue, the heavy, soundproof door at the back of the room opened. It was Kalen. He stood there for a moment, a newly minted ensign, looking impossibly young in his crisp uniform. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at our parents. He looked straight at the committee. He walked forward with a purpose that seemed years beyond his age. "Sirs, Senator," he said, his voice trembling but clear, "with all due respect to the committee, you are being presented with a false narrative." A stunned silence fell over the room. My father started to rise, a sharp "Kalen" on his lips, but Senator Hayes held up a hand, silencing him. "Let the ensign speak." Kalen's eyes finally met mine, and in them I saw an apology and a plea. Then he turned back to the committee. "My family has lied. For 15 years we have lied about my sister. She is not a failure. She is not a disgrace." His voice grew stronger. "She is a hero. And I have evidence that this committee is being manipulated." He strode to the presentation console and inserted a USB drive. A moment later, a video file appeared on the large screen. The face of retired Colonel Evelyn Valkyrie Shaw, sharp and indignant, filled the room. The audio was crystal clear, the recording of her furious confrontation with Reed. "You will not sacrifice another good officer to cover your own tracks, Donovan," Shaw's voice boomed. "I know you falsified that report. We both do." Colonel Reed's face went ashen. The confident smirk vanished, replaced by a look of pure, panicked fury. My father stared at the screen, his mouth slightly agape, the color draining from his face. The foundation of their world was cracking. As the video ended, the door opened again. This time it was Ren and Leo, both dressed in sharp civilian clothes, their expressions grim and determined. And walking behind them were 2 other men. They were older, with weathered faces and the dignified bearing of those who have seen too much. They were dressed in simple, traditional Afghan clothing. It was the father of the little girl I had carried out of the burning building, and the village elder. The truth was no longer an abstract report. It was now present in the room, with a human face. Finally, it was my turn. I stood and walked to the head of the table. The room was utterly silent. Every eye was on me. They expected a defense, a passionate speech, an emotional plea. I gave them none of it. I didn't need to. I reached into my pocket and took out a small, simple audio player. I placed it on the polished table, the plastic device looking small and insignificant in the cavernous room. I plugged it into the room's audio system. Then I looked directly at Colonel Reed, at my father, and at the committee. I pressed play. The next 7 minutes were filled with the raw, unfiltered truth of Dagger Point. The crackle of comms, the sound of gunfire, the shouts of my men, the panicked voice of Leo laying out an impossible choice, then the 4 seconds of silence, a silence so heavy, so profound, it seemed to suck all the air out of the hearing room. 4 seconds where I held 23 lives in my hands, and then my own voice, devoid of panic, stripped of emotion, clear and authoritative. "Evacuate the civilians. First priority, the data can wait. Echo, get a medevac chopper on the line, now." When the recording finished, I pressed stop. I didn't say a word. I simply stood there, letting the silence that followed do the work. It was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the silence of shame or secrecy. It was the silence of irrefutable truth. The silence that follows a checkmate. I had not come here to fight. I had come here to let the truth speak for itself. And in the wreckage of their lies, its voice was deafening. The aftermath of a battle is never glorious. It's quiet. It's exhausting. After the hearing, I felt a profound sense of release, but it was followed by the deep, bone-weary fatigue of a soldier who has just come off the line. The victory wasn't a front-page headline in the Washington Post. There was no public vindication, no formal apology from the Navy. The system, as always, protected itself. The news came 2 days later, not in a press release, but in a discreet, forwarded email from Wren. It was an internal Navy directive. It stated in cold, bureaucratic language that Colonel Donovan Reed was being granted an immediate request for early retirement, effective immediately, citing health reasons. He wasn't punished, he was simply erased. The system didn't admit a mistake, it just removed the cancerous tumor and moved on. Reed, the architect of lies, had vanished into the very silence he had tried to condemn me to. There was a grim, fitting justice in that. That evening, a car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. It was my father. He got out of his Lexus, but he wasn't the man I had faced in the hearing room. The imposing uniform was gone, replaced by a simple, slightly frayed cashmere sweater. The armor was off. He walked to my porch but stopped at the bottom step, as if he knew he hadn't yet earned the right to come closer. He didn't look at me, but at his own expensive polished shoes, now dusty from my gravel driveway. "I was wrong," he said, his voice raspy, stripped of its command. The words seemed to cause him physical pain. "All those years, I was so afraid of you failing, of you embarrassing us, that I couldn't allow myself to see that you had succeeded beyond anything I could have imagined." He finally looked up, his eyes filled with a weary sorrow. "I'm sorry, Tiana." I just nodded. There was nothing else to say. It was a start. A few days later, Kalen came. He showed up unannounced, holding a familiar pink and white box from Goody's Donuts, the place we used to beg our grandfather to take us to as kids. He didn't say much at first. We just sat on the porch swing, the old chains creaking a familiar rhythm, and ate the warm glazed donuts. "I've been looking at you through Dad's eyes my whole life," he finally admitted, staring out at the trees. "I saw your silence as shame. I saw your absence as failure. I believed the story because it was easier than questioning him." He turned to me, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. "I was wrong, Tiana. I'm so sorry. I should have seen you, not the ghost they told me you were." Then came the call from my mother. I almost didn't answer, but I did. Her voice was thick with tears. The carefully constructed composure of the DC socialite finally shattered. "I was wrong," she sobbed. "I was so wrong not to ask. I was so worried about what the neighbors would say, what my friends at the club would think, that I forgot to ask how my own daughter was feeling. I forgot to be your mother. I'm so sorry, Tiana. Can you ever forgive me?" They were the words I had once thought I would die to hear. But now, as they finally came, they didn't bring the elation I had expected. There was just a deep, aching sadness for the 15 years we had lost, and beneath it, a quiet, fragile sense of relief. The wound was still there, but the poison was finally being drawn out. The ultimate test came the following Sunday. I agreed to a family dinner at their house in Georgetown, the first in years. The atmosphere was strained, filled with the cautious politeness of strangers trying to learn a new language. Over a roast beef dinner that was far too formal, my father cleared his throat. "Tiana," he said, looking at me with a newfound hesitant respect. "I've made some calls. There's a senior advisory position at the Pentagon, working directly with the Joint Staff on Special Operations Strategy. It's yours if you want it." He smiled, a hopeful, tentative expression. "It would be a way to bring you back into the fold, a way for us to be a family again." I saw their expectant faces, my mother hopeful, Kaylin encouraging, and my father offering me a place at his table in his world as a way of making amends. It was the old way, the Brooks way, defining family by position and proximity to power. I gently set my fork down on the fine china. "Thank you, Dad," I said, my voice calm and steady. But no, the air grew still. "My path isn't in the Pentagon anymore," I continued, looking at each of them in turn. "And family isn't a position you can appoint someone to." I took a breath. "I love you all, but I can't go back to being a character in the Brooks family story. From now on, I have to write my own. And if you want to be a part of my story, you'll have to accept me for who I truly am, not for who you want me to be." It wasn't an ultimatum. It was a declaration of independence, a new boundary, drawn not with anger, but with the quiet, unshakable strength of self-respect. A month after the hearing, I drove east towards the rising sun and the salt-laced air of the Atlantic. My destination was Virginia Beach, but not for the boardwalk or the tourists. I was making a pilgrimage. I parked and walked towards the Navy SEAL Memorial, a place I had only seen in pictures. It was a somber, powerful monument, a wall of polished black granite bearing the names of the fallen, guarded by a bronze statue of a combat swimmer. I wasn't wearing a uniform. I wasn't there as Commander Brooks. I was just Tiana, a civilian paying her respects. I walked along the wall, my fingers tracing the cool, sharp edges of the engraved letters. So many names, so many stories cut short. I finally found the ones I was looking for, etched side by side: Petty Officer First Class Marcus Riptide Chen and Staff Sergeant Ben Sawbones Carter, the two men from my team who didn't make it home from Dagger Point. I knelt and gently placed a single white rose beneath each name. It wasn't a mission, it wasn't a duty, it was an act of love, a final report to my men. For years I had carried the weight of their loss as their commander. But here, today, I was just a survivor, honoring the brothers who had fought beside me in the silence. Tears streamed down my face, but they weren't tears of grief or guilt. They were tears of release, a quiet acknowledgement of a debt that could never be repaid, but could finally be honored in the light. A few weeks later, an unexpected invitation came from Kaylin. He asked me to meet him back at Annapolis. Not for a ceremony, not for any official function, just for a walk. We met on a crisp autumn afternoon and walked along the seawall, watching the midshipmen drill on the fields. It was the same path I used to run every morning as a cadet, my lungs burning, my mind focused on survival. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Kaylin began, his voice quiet, thoughtful. "About writing my own story. I realize now that for my entire life, I've just been reading from Dad's script." He stopped and looked out over the Severn River. "I was so determined to be the perfect son, the perfect Brooks, that I never stopped to ask if the story was true." He turned to me, his eyes clear and full of a new, hard-won respect. "You taught me something important, Tiana. You taught me that real courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you are." I smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. In that moment, I realized I had lost the little brother I felt I always had to protect. But I had gained a man I could finally respect. We were no longer defined by our roles in our father's world. We were just a brother and a sister, finding our way back to each other. The circle was closing. The story ends where it began for me, in the quiet solitude of my cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. But the silence is different now. I sat on my porch this morning, a steaming mug of black coffee warming my hands, and watched the sun rise over the misty peaks. The first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, a quiet, breathtaking spectacle. The secure satellite reader, once a lifeline to a secret world, was now packed away in a box in the attic. My phone, which had buzzed with tension and anger for so long, now rested silently on the table beside me. The silence that was once my prison, a cold, isolating cage, had become a sanctuary. It was a space filled not with loneliness, but with freedom. The freedom to be simply me. I didn't change the world. I didn't bring down the system. But I had fought for and won back my own small corner of it. I had won the most important battle of all, the one for the right to own my own story, to be the author of my own life. I took a sip of my coffee, the warm, bitter taste grounding me in the present. The air was cool and clean. The birds were beginning to sing their morning chorus. For the first time in 15 years, I felt completely and utterly at peace. I felt like I was truly home. My story has found its peace, but I know there are so many other stories out there, still waiting to be told. Stories of quiet strength, of misunderstood sacrifices, of finding your own light after years in the shadows. Your story matters, and I'd be honored to hear a piece of it. If a part of my journey resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. What does writing your own story mean to you? And if you believe in the power of stories like these, please like, share, and subscribe to the Chosen Revenge channel. Together, we can make sure no story goes unheard.